Chapter 9. Marx, Marginalism, and Modern Sociology. The antinomies of sociology and the dilemma of liberalism. We are now in a position to return to the question posed in the first chapter of the character and scientific status of the reorientation of social thought that took place at the end of the 19th century. There is little doubt that such a reorientation did in fact take place, and that this reorientation did not simply involve a change in a number of elements of a given system. It involved a fundamental change in the, quote, structure of the theoretical system, end quote, Parsons. According to Parsons, this change was marked by the substantive advance represented by the emergence of a voluntaristic theory of action out of the convergence of the earlier positivistic and idealistic theories of action. However, I hope to have shown in the course of this book that the development of marginalism and of Weberian sociology was not marked by such a substantive scientific revolution. The substantive foundation of marginalism and of Weber's sociology continues to be the naturalistic conception of the social relations of production of capitalist society that characterized 19th century classical political economy, vulgar economy, sociology, and historicism. The end of the 19th century saw a reorientation of social thought, not a scientific revolution. In Parsons' terms, this reorientation was marked by a reformulation of the relationship between the theory of action and the theory of social structure. Classical political economy. Dude, I'm gonna kill that fucking crow. Classical political economy, Comtean sociology, and German historicism developed their theories as theories of social structure. Political economy was particularly concerned with the economic structure of capitalist society, while sociology and historicism superimposed on this economic structure a concern with capitalist moral and political institutions. The economy, morality, and the state were treated for theoretical purposes as sui generis realities, whose development was ideally regulated by the structural laws of economic, moral, and political evolution. Although formulated as theories of social structure, political economy, sociology, and historicism shared a liberal social and political orientation, seeing capitalist society as an expression of the needs and aspirations of rational individuals, and evaluated the institutions of capitalist society in relation to individual rationality. This did not mean that these theories were formulated on the basis of a rationalistic theory of action, whether positivistic or idealistic, for the theories were not formulated at the level of the theory of action. The rational individual, who underpinned and legitimated the social structure characterized by the theory, was not a real, but an ideal individual. The conformity of the social structure with individual needs and aspirations was not conceptualized directly, by revealing the origins of social institutions in the actions of real individuals and establishing the adequacy of those institutions to the individual's needs and aspirations. Rather, the rationality of the social structure in question was explained in terms of its results, by showing that those results conformed objectively to the abstractly defined needs and aspirations of the real rational individual. The achievement of this ideal society could not be entrusted to the spontaneous advance of individual reason, for the existence of ignorance, vanity, prejudice, superstition, and the abuse of power were barriers to its realization. Thus, the progressive development of society depended on the subordination of the action of individuals to the reproduction of the social structure within which those individuals were inserted. For classical political economy, this implied the subordination of the individual, the state, and civil society to the market through which the classical economic laws would spontaneously impose a harmonious social order. For sociology and historicism, the market alone was not an adequate basis for the realization. For sociology and historicism, the market alone was not an adequate basis for the realization of a rational and harmonious social order, and the operation of the market had to be confined within set limits by morality and the state. In each case, however, the social structure to whose reproduction individuals were subordinated was defined by the social relations of capitalist production, and the ideal rationality of society was an expression of the naturalistic rationality of capitalist relations of production as the necessary expression of the division of labor. It was this common naturalization of social constraints imposed by capitalist social relations that defines the common ideological foundations of all these theories of capitalist society. It is important to stress the liberalism of these 19th century theories, despite the fact that this liberalism was abstract. Thus, the subordination of the individual to the reproduction of the social structure was not seen as an imposition of an alien authority on the individual, but as the imposition of an authority adequate to the true needs and aspirations of the individual. Thus, to the extent that individuals were enlightened by the appropriate doctrines, and so appreciated the rationality of the ideal social order, they would submit themselves voluntarily to the authority of the market, the enlightened legislator, and the moral reformer. Jesus Christ. The viability of this abstract liberalism, and correspondingly the viability of its abstract social theories, rested on the viability of the constitutional arrangements through which the beneficent rule of capital could be enforced for the benefit of all. It was the growing reluctance of the organized working class to submit to such rule, and its insistence on being admitted to the Constitution on its own terms, that undermined not only the paternalistic rule of capital, but also the social theories that express this rule in the form of an abstract liberalism that subordinated real individuals to an ideal rationality. As the rationality of capitalism faced a growing intellectual, moral, and political challenge, the rationalist critique of capitalism passed from the hands of liberalism into those of socialism. If liberal reformism was to distinguish itself from socialism, it had to reevaluate its own foundations. The reorientation of social thought at the turn of the century revolved around the marginalist revolution in economics. Marginalism was based on a rejection of the classical theory of distribution associated with the theory of class, on the basis of which classical political economy had developed its economic laws, in favor of a rigorously individualistic theory of the capitalist economy. Based on the classical theories of production and exchange, but reformulated within the framework of the theory of action. Classical political economy had centered its analysis on production, and established the ideal rationality of capitalist relations of distribution and exchange in terms of their conformity with the requirements of the expanded reproduction of the system of production. Marginalist economics centered its analysis on the individual allocating scarce resources to alternative uses. For classical political economy, the individual actor was passive, playing a mediating role in the expanded reproduction of the system. Subordinated by relations of distribution and exchange to the requirements of that reproduction. Thus, the theory of action was subordinate to the theory of social structure. For marginalism, by contrast, the economic actor was the subject of the capitalist system of production, distribution, and exchange. which was analyzed as the means by which the allocation of resources could be optimally achieved on the basis of given preferences and a given initial distribution. Thus, for marginalism, the theory of social structure was developed on the basis of the theory of action. This made it possible to reconstitute social theory on a rigorously individualistic foundation, which sought to provide a coherent foundation for a critique of all forms of utopianism on the basis of a pragmatic liberal reformism. The development of marginalism introduced significant changes of emphasis in the understanding of capitalist society. Where classical political economy centered its analysis on questions of growth and distribution, marginalism centered its analysis on questions of allocation and exchange. Where classical political economy justified capitalism on the basis of its development of the forces of production, marginalism justified capitalism on the basis of its allocative efficiency. Where classical political economy developed its laws of distribution on the basis of the natural laws of population and agricultural productivity, marginalism justified distribution relations in terms of the productive contributions of the appropriate factors of production. However, marginalism remained on essentially the same ideological foundations as marginalism's predecessors, those foundations being defined by the naturalization of capitalist relations of production. Indeed, marginalism, in rejecting the classical theory of class, abandoned precisely that element of classical political economy that contained within it the possibility of recognizing that capitalism rests not on the rational adaptation of society to its natural foundations, but arises on the basis of historically specific social relations of production. Thus, marginalism completed the naturalization of capitalist social relations by narrowing the scope of economics, in assigning the analysis of distribution to complementary sociological and historical disciplines, whilst broadening its ambition in seeking to analyze the conditions for the optimal allocation of resources appropriate to any society. The development of marginalist economics, far from representing a scientific revolution, removed from political economy its promising elements to achieve an ideological reformulation of political economy appropriate to the economic and political maturation of capitalist society. Sorry, I know that's gross, but my allergies are out of control today. It's a nice day, though. I can't sit inside. Chug, chug, chug. 19th century sociology and historicism developed in opposition to classical political economy, but I have argued that they rested on common ideological foundations. We find the same relation of complementarity between marginalist economics and modern sociology. However, whereas 19th century sociology and historicism had to oppose the absolutist claims of political economy, marginalism created a space within which economics and sociology could coexist as complementary disciplines. Economic theory is an abstract deductive science that establishes the ideal rationality of the fundamental economic institutions and social relations of capitalist society. Social economics was the complementary discipline that would study the contingent institutional barriers that impeded the realization of the ideal rationality of capitalist economic relations. The practical and theoretical tasks of social economics was to make capitalism adequate to capitalism's own rhetoric. Its ideological function was to locate the irrationality of actually existing capitalism at a lower level of abstraction than its rationality, as defined by economic theory. Social economics was essentially an empirical discipline, deriving its concepts from economic theory and measuring reality against the ideal established by marginalist theory. However, the marginalist theory also created the space within which sociology could develop a broader critique. The framework within which such a sociology could develop was that of the theory of action. The concepts of economic theory and the concept of economic power, that was the single theoretical contribution of social economics, were elaborated on the basis of the abstract model of the rational economic actor. Consideration of other ends and of other value orientations of action provided a basis on which other forms of social action could be conceptualized. Moreover, the economist's rational economic actor was an abstract concept, whose appropriateness depended on the dominance of a rational orientation to economic ends in actually existing societies. Thus, sociology had also to explore the socio-historical circumstances under which an orientation was in fact predominant. On the basis of the voluntaristic theory of action, sociology could locate both itself and economics as complementary social sciences. It was Weber who most rigorously articulated a systematic foundation on which sociology could develop as an autonomous branch of the social sciences. Weber was able to do this because he rejected the primacy accorded by the economists, to economic rationality as an ethical ideal, insisting that political, religious, moral, or aesthetic criteria provided just as valid a basis for evaluation and correspondingly provided just as valid an orientation of social action. Do you guys hear that fucking bee flying around? Maybe it's a fly. No, I'm not looking up. Sociology could become an autonomous discipline because sociology would study forms of social action that could not be comprehended by economics. Sociology can embrace all of those phenomena that could not be reduced to the dogma of self-interest. In this sense, it was Weber who developed the conceptual foundations for both modern economics and modern sociology. These foundations were classically elaborated in the 1930s for modern economics by Lionel Robbins in an essay on the nature and significance of economic science, and for modern sociology by Talcott Parsons in The Structure of Social Action. However, it was only with the economic, social, political, and intellectual reconstruction of the capitalist world after the Second World War, a reconstruction motivated above all by the concern to find a place for the working class within a liberal economic and political world system, that the older traditions were finally swept away. The social sciences constituted on unequivocally liberal foundations, and the intellectual division of labor between, quote, economics and, quote, sociology rigorously institutionalized. Despite the fact that modern sociology has developed in opposition to the naturalistic rationalism of marginalist economics, it nevertheless rests on the same ideological foundations. These ideological foundations are not necessarily formulated explicitly, for the intellectual division of labor that separates sociology from economics and assigns the task of analysis of the social relations of capitalist production to economics, establishes the ideological foundations of sociology outside its own domain. Thus, Weber, although consistently critical of the naturalism of marginalist economics, nevertheless presupposed the marginalist naturalization of capitalist social relations, in taking the abstract individual as his starting point, and in identifying the defining characteristics of capitalist society, as the rational value orientation of that individual. The ideological foundation of modern sociology, in the naturalistic conception of the economy, developed by marginalist economics, is necessarily implicit in the definition of the object of sociology. Quote, society, as distinct from the object of economics, the quote, economy, which establishes both the character and the limits of sociological explanation. It is important to stress that the distinction between the quote, economy and quote, society, and the corresponding division of labor between economics and sociology, so taken for granted today, is a modern invention, whose general acceptance in academic institutionalization, in its modern form, only dates back to the 1940s. It is a distinction that was forged by the marginalists in opposition to the overweening ambition of the sociological and historicist critics of political economy, for whom economics would merely be, quote, a congeries of miscellaneous disconnected facts, or else it must fall in as one branch of Mr. Spencer's sociology, end quote. As against this, the marginalists insisted that, quote, there must arise a science of the development of economic forms and relations, end quote. Jevons. It was on the basis of the development of this abstract science and of the recognition that such a science, quote, must be interpreted as the formulation of the relations of a limited group of analytical elements in the broader concrete system of action, end quote, that the intellectual division of labor between economics and sociology was worked out. The distinction between economy and society is not an empirical distinction, but a conceptual one, resting on the conceptual distinction between the essential rationality of capitalism and capitalism's social reality, a distinction that in turn rests on the definition of economic relations as essentially asocial, concerning not relations between people, but relations of subjective evaluation of things by abstract individuals, mediated by the technical relations of production and the formal relations of exchange. The definition of the nature and significance, not only of modern economics, but also of modern sociology, depends on the legitimacy of the economist's abstraction of social actors from their social and historical context, an abstraction that is based on the definition of economics, not as the science of a particular set of social relations, but of a particular orientation of action. Quote, the science which studies the processes of rational acquisition of scarce means to the actors' ends up by production and economic exchange, and of their rational allocation as between alternative uses, end quote. Parsons, 1949. Sociology is not necessarily content to occupy the space allocated to sociology by marginalist economics. However, as we have seen in the case of Weber's sociology, the sociological critique of the narrow economic rationalism of marginalist economics cuts the ground from under its own feet. This presents any critical sociology with an acute dilemma, which appears in the irreconcilability of the voluntarism of the theory of action that defines the autonomy of sociology with the implicit naturalism of the theory of social structure on which it ultimately rests. Although sociology can define its object and formulate its methodology within the framework of the theory of action, The theory of action cannot provide the ultimate foundation of sociological explanation. The theory of action abstracts the individual from the social relations within which alone she exists as a social individual. Thus, a formal sociology, like that of Zimmel, which seeks to explain social relations as the product of the subjective orientation of action, can never achieve such an explanation, since any such explanation presupposes a substantive context for social action, which is defined by the very social relations that the reference to action purports to explain. On the other hand, theory equally abstracts these social relations from the action of individuals, through which alone they are reproduced and transformed. The result is that, quote, a structural sociology ends up referring the explanation of the social relations of capitalist production to the functional requirements of their own reproduction. A circularity which is only broken by the marginalist, quote, naturalization of capitalist social relations as the rational expression of the natural and technological conditions of social existence. This dilemma pervades Weber's sociology, but it was not of Weber's making. It is the constitutive and irresolvable liberal dilemma on which modern sociology is based. Weber evaded rather than resolved it by limiting the scope of sociology to the interpretive understanding of concrete social situations and representing the dilemma as the inescapable fate of humanity. Weber's liberal empiricism provides an attractive way out of the liberal dilemma. Weber's methodology of the ideal type even provides a means by which sociology can aspire to a degree of generality. Weber's methodology of the ideal type even provides a means by which sociology can aspire to a degree of generality, giving a semblance of intellectual rigor to sociological empiricism. However, the methodology of the ideal type is unable to provide any rational foundation for the generalizations which it produces, because it provides no other grounds for the abstraction on which it is based than the empathic understanding of the motivation of the hypothetical actor. While most sociologists may be content to tell plausible stories, and to give such stories a spurious scientific authority by backing them up with statistical investigations, sociology cannot be content to take its object, social relations and social institutions, as given. These social relations and social institutions have a systematic social significance that it is the task of sociology to elucidate by elaborating the systematic connections between norms, values, social relations, and social institutions. To evade the liberal dilemma is not to resolve the liberal dilemma. The liberal dilemma lies in the contradiction between the voluntaristic theory of action, which is the necessary basis of any liberal democratic theory, that believes that a legitimate social order is compatible with the freedom of the individual property owner, and the naturalistic theory of social structure, which defines the objective constraints which characterize such action as social. This dilemma defines the terms within which modern sociology is developed. However, the two poles of the contrast are not independent of one another. Rather, they are constituted as complementary, but mutually exclusive perspectives on society by the ideological abstraction of the individual, on the one hand, and nature on the other. From the historically developed social relations of capitalist production, which alone mediate the relation between the individual and nature, and within which alone nature and the individual exist socially. Thus, modern sociology is condemned to exist within a world defined by a series of abstract dualisms, which reflect the inadequacy of its foundations, but which nevertheless structure sociological debate. Structure, action, object, subject, positivism, humanism, holism, individualism, society, individual, explanation, understanding, order, conflict, authority, consent. Through all the twists and turns of sophisticated theoretical debate, the same themes constantly recur. It would be tedious to go through every, quote, original thinker in detail. In the next sections, I can only indicate the Achilles heel of modern sociology in the broadest of outlines. The marginalist foundations of Parsonian functionalism. Weber fell back on a liberal empiricism because he was unable to resolve the dilemma with which he had confronted sociology. On the one hand, Weber explained the social relationships and social institutions of capitalist society in terms of the generalized process of, quote, rationalization, which was only the subjective expression of the naturalistic theory of capitalist social relations developed by marginalist economics. From this point of view, a, quote, rational value orientation was imposed on society as the means of achieving economic and administrative efficiency. On the other hand, Weber insisted that such a, quote, rational value orientation was culturally and historically specific to Western civilization and undermined the, quote, substantive rationality embodied in alternative value orientations, which appealed to higher values but which had no rational foundation. Thus, Weber's sociology was caught between the naturalistic rationalism of marginalist economics and the romantic irrationalism of German idealist philosophy, to the extent that modern sociology has not simply evaded the Weberian dilemma by relapsing into a complacent empiricism. It has remained strung between these two poles. The rationalistic elements in Weber's sociology provided the basis of the Parsonian tradition, while the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory developed out of Weber's irrationalist critique of capitalism. Paradoxically, it was Parsons who had acclaimed the voluntaristic theory of action as the basis of modern sociology, who assimilated sociology back into the naturalistic ideology of modern economics, drawing heavily on the organic evolutionism of 19th century sociology, and in particular on the functionalism of Durkheim and increasingly of Spencer. In The Structure of Social Action, Parsons had identified the roots of the crisis of contemporary liberalism in the face of the threat of the authoritarian collectivism of the left and the right, as lying in the restricted conception of the individual inherited from liberal social theories of the 19th century. Parsons defined the task of sociology as nothing less than the salvation of liberalism, which was to be achieved on the basis of the sociological critique of marginalist economics pioneered, above all, by Weber, a critique which brought cultural values to the center of the stage as the mediating link between individual and society. However, Parsons argued that Weber's radical individualism prevented him from resolving the dilemma with which he had confronted sociology of reconciling the constitutive role of the subject with the constraining character of social structures. Parsons criticized Weber for failing to address the problem of order in failing to give any account of the processes by which the subjectivity of the social order is reconciled with the objective constraints of social reproduction. From this point of view, the central weakness of Weber's sociology lay in his belief that ends and values are historically contingent and purely a matter of individual choice. For Parsons, by contrast, values are constituted socially and articulated in cultural value systems. It is the cultural value system which mediates between the subjectivity of the individual and the objectivity of social structure. The adoption of values cannot be a matter of his individual choice, because social individuals only exist through their incorporation into such value systems. This incorporation is achieved through the socialization of the child and reproduced through mechanisms of social control. Parsons developed his, quote, structural functionalism in response to the problem of explaining how the ends and value orientations of action are so defined as to make possible the reproduction of the social relations within which actors exist and that structure the subjective orientation of action. Parsons distinguished between the universal generic properties of, quote, action systems and the contingent forms of such systems in particular societies. On this basis, he sought to establish a generic connection between the functional requirements of social reproduction and the characteristics of the system of norms and values which oriented social action, without postulating a necessary genetic connection between the two. This involved a cybernetic conception of the individual, society, and nature, according to which each subsystem sought to secure its own harmonious integration, and through the hierarchical organization of such systems, the integration of the system as whole. Thus, the norms and values of society change as sources of strain, emerging particularly from developments in the economy which mediates the relation between humanity and nature, are transmitted through the dislocation of the system of cultural values to the individual personality, whose efforts to resolve the psychological tensions which arise leads to changes in norms and values which secure the reintegration of the system as a whole. In this way, Parsons believed that he had resolved the, quote, problem of order on a reconstituted liberal foundation. Social integration was maintained by a cultural system which was not enforced by an authoritarian state or church, but by the self-regulation of the individual personality within the social community. Values are neither imposed on the individual by society, nor are values freely adopted by the atomic individual. Values develop within society as an intersubjective realm of cultural communication. From the Parsonian viewpoint, Weber's pessimism expressed his lack of faith in the possibility of a pluralistic, liberal, democratic society. His lack of faith in the possibility that a pluralistic, liberal, democratic society could provide the institutional framework within which a normative consensus could reconcile social reproduction with individual aspirations. Parsons' elaborate schemata only resolved the problem of order by shifting the problem of order to the cultural level and turning it into a tautology. His postulated universals transposed the objective problem of order into a subjective problem. In defining the generic properties of action systems in terms of the normative requirements imposed by the need to resolve the problem of order. An orderly and well-integrated society was therefore one in which social institutions were adapted to both the objective and subjective conditions of social order, the reconcilability of which was guaranteed by the supposedly universal properties of action. Within Parsons' action frame of reference, economics was attributed its place as the theory appropriate to a particular subsystem of the social system, defined in relation to the, quote, adaptive function of the system of action, while sociology, political science, and psychology provide theories appropriate to other functions of, quote, goal attainment, quote, integration, and, quote, latent pattern maintenance, end quote. However, the apparent subordination of economics to sociology in the form of the general theory of action is only superficial. For the general theory of action is itself based on the generalization of the theory and methods of marginalist economics. Thus, the universals of the general theory of action are defined in relation to the universal constraints of nature and technology, which are the only objective constraints on social action and the only non-arbitrary source of social and cultural change. These constraints ultimately express the functional imperatives defined by the marginalist's naturalistic conception of the social relations of capitalist production, while the possibility of normative consensus is defined by the economist's characterization of the rationality of the economic institutions of a capitalist society. In this way, Parsons extended the marginalist naturalization of capitalist social relations from the sphere of the economy to that of society, treating the state, religion, the family, and the personality as rational expressions of the natural and technological conditions of existence of industrial society. In so doing, Parsons undermined the hard-won autonomy of sociology by subordinating the interpretation of social action to the supposedly objective requirements of social reproduction. Structure and action in post-Parsonian sociology. Parsons sought to resolve the Weberian dilemma by adopting Durkheim's conception of society as a transcendental moral order, which mediates between the subjectivity of the individual personality and the objectivity of nature and of technology. Within the Parsonian framework of the conflict between the aspirations of the individual and the normative expectations of society is only an index of a failure of integration of the subsystems which comprise society as a cultural order. However, the source of this failure may lie on the side of the normative expectations of society, or it may lie on the side of the aspirations of the individual. How is Parsons to decide whether social conflict is the result of a lack of integration between particular cultural subsystems, or whether social conflict is the result of a failure of socialization and social control? Is socialism a personality disorder, or does socialism express a conflict between the values of equality, justice, and freedom embedded in civil society and expressed through the political system and the reality of economic exploitation? And how is this conflict to be resolved? Is it to be left to the spontaneous development of society, with the risk that psychopathological disorders will infect the system as a whole, leading to further disintegration? Or is it to be resolved by the state, with the risk that necessary social reforms will be blocked by escalating repression? At its most abstract level, Parsons' schema offers no answer to such questions, precisely because there is no principled means of establishing the boundary between the voluntarism of action and the constraint of structure. In Parsons' own elaboration of his system, the answer is clear. The instrumental rationality of the economic institutions of capitalist society give them an absolute status to which all the other subsystems of society have ultimately to adjust. To the extent that the other subsystems are not functionally adapted to the reproduction of the economic subsystem, the appropriate response to social conflict is social reform. To the extent that such an adjustment has been achieved, the appropriate response to social conflict is psychotherapy and sociotherapy. The agency which determines and implements the appropriate response is the democratic state. But this only raises the question of the character and limits of the legitimacy of the state. For Parsons, the legitimacy of the state derives from the formation of a normative consensus within a formally democratic and pluralistic political system. However, this makes the state the foundation of its own legitimacy, which violates the most fundamental principles of liberalism. Parsons' sociological enterprise provided a powerful ideological underpinning for the project of restoring a liberal democratic capitalism on a world scale in the wake of World War II, and a celebration of the liberal democratic optimism of the Eisenhower era. However, the persistence of social, political, and cultural conflict cast a growing shadow over Parsons' complacent optimism, and, in particular, brought the limits of his liberalism to the fore. Within Parsons' system, the role of subjectivity was strictly circumscribed by the functional need to resolve the problem of order, and the resources available to the subject to resolve that problem were limited to those provided by the cultural system. Parsons had only resolved the problem of order by abolishing the integrity of the subject. Despite the inadequacy of Parsons' solution of the liberal dilemma, his system nevertheless defined the framework within and against which sociology had developed in the second half of the 20th century. Sociology has sought to build on Parsons' formulation of the dilemma by, quote, bringing the subject back in, end quote, explaining the articulation and development of cultural systems not in terms of the functional imperatives imposed by the problem of order, but as the negotiated product of intersubjective communication. During the 1960s and 1970s, the dominant critiques of Parsons came from the phenomenological and symbolic interactionist traditions, which drew particularly on the work of Alfred Schutz, George Herbert Mead, and Harold Garfinkel, to see society as a symbolic order. However, these solutions merely shifted from one pole of the dilemma to the other, restoring the constitutive role of the subject, but evading the problem of order by denying the objectivity of the sources of conflict which threaten such order. The rejection of Parsonian explanation merely led back to the superficiality of a relativistic interpretive sociology. Neo-Weberianism provided a more radical critique of the, quote, culturalism of both Parsonian and phenomenological sociology in insisting on the irreducibility of conflicts of material interests, political aspirations, and cultural values as articulated by classes, parties, and status groups within a pluralistic economic, political, and cultural system. However, Neo-Weberianism only resurrected the dilemmas of its Weberian form, for it could not define any coherent basis on which to reconstitute the unity of a society riven by conflict and fragmentation, nor could it reconcile its analysis of the objective foundations of conflict with a subjective approach to meaning. Thus, Neo-Weberianism merely led back to an empiricist approach to issues of power and social conflict. The fragmentation of sociology in the 1970s led to a proliferation of schools of thought, each of which offered a partial solution to the Weberian dilemma, but none of which was able to resolve it. The 1980s saw a swing of the pendulum back towards a synthetic reconstruction, which would solve the problem by reconstituting a systematic sociology. Thus, this, quote, post-Parsonian sociology, developed with different emphasis by Habermas, Giddens, and Alexander, sought to reinsert a Weberian concern with meaning into the Parsonian framework. On the one hand, post-Parsonian sociology replaced Parsons' functionally defined universals of action with universals which were supposedly inherent in the constitutive activity of the subject in the development of intersubjective systems of meaning. On the other hand, it followed Lockwood in distinguishing between, quote, social integration and, quote, system integration, to distinguish between the normative consensus, which defined the rules of the game, and the diversity of norms and material interests, which define the conflicting aspirations of the various players. Social integration does not require system integration, but only a general agreement to abide by the rules of the game and to respect the outcome of the resolution of conflict according to those rules. The problem remains, however, of drawing the line between the two. Where does the boundary between social integration and system integration, between structure and action, between, quote, materialist and, quote, idealist explanation, between, quote, practical and, quote, communicative interests lie? Although post-Parsonian sociology avoids Parsons' reification of society, it does not resolve the problem of subject and object, action and structure, which Parsons defined as the problem of order, but simply reformulates it as a dualistic conception of society. On the one hand, society exists as an objective structure, defining the normative and material context of action, while on the other hand, society is constituted as an intersubjective realm of meaning by the intentions of social subjects. Actually existing society is a battleground between these two aspects of society, in which it is impossible to determine a priori which will prevail. Post-Parsonian sociology certainly offers a more critical solution to the problem of order than did Parsons. But it is not clear that it is in any way more satisfactory. The possibility of order presupposes that there is a rational basis for consensus, which for Parsons lies in the instrumental rationality of the capitalist society, the capitalist economy. The possibility of order presupposes that there is a rational basis for consensus, which for Parsons lies in the instrumental rationality of the capitalist economy. Post-Parsonian sociology retains the radical separation of the, quote, instrumental rationality of the fundamental institutions of capitalism as a means of provision for human material need from the, quote, substantive irrationality, end quote, of capitalism as a means of realizing human cultural aspirations. The realization of these human cultural aspirations depends not on transforming the social relations of production, but on confining the application of instrumental rationality to instrumental rationality's proper sphere, the economy, building a substantive rational society by strengthening the sphere of, quote, culture or, quote, civil society, in which the interaction of free and equal individuals can lead to the formation of a rational normative consensus. The possibility of a reconciliation of the instrumental rationality of the capitalist economy and the substantive rationality of civil society clearly rests on the radical separation of, quote, labor and, quote, social interaction, of, quote, instrumental and, quote, communicative reason, of, quote, objectivity and, quote, subjectivity, of, quote, structure and, quote, action, which was the basis of the marginalist revolution in economics. The post-Parsonian solution, no less than those of Parsons and Weber, clearly implies that the productive and allocative efficiency of capitalism as a form of social production, as theorized by marginalist economics, can be radically distinguished from the substantive irrationality of capitalism as a form of domination. Post-Parsonian sociology is caught between the irreconcilable poles of structure and action. Like Parsons' theory, post-Parsonian sociology can explain both structure and action, but it cannot explain both at the same time. If the structure is given, the scope of action is defined. But action's limits are already arbitrarily predetermined. If the structure is not given, then the scope of action is unconstrained, and there is no space for the structure to occupy. Explanation can only be based on teleological determinations, external to either structure or action, located in the transcendental realm of, quote, culture, the, quote, life world, or, quote, structuration, which only serves to reconstitute the problem at another level. In practice, post-Parsonians evade the issue. Like Weber before them, oscillating arbitrarily between the point of view of structure and the point of view of action, and so reducing their sociology to an evaluative framework in which to achieve an interpretive understanding of social action, which has no explanatory power. The dilemma remains because it is inherent in the radical separation of structure and action, economy and society, instrumental and communicative reason, which defines the analytical foundations of marginalist economics and modern sociology. Post-Parsonian sociology does not advance beyond Hegelian philosophy and classical political economy, because post-Parsonian sociology can only see the individual, alternatively as a cultural construct, leading to a romantic organicism, or as a biological individual, leading to a naturalistic liberalism. Post-Parsonian sociology cannot identify the social foundations on which individuality is constructed as a form of sociability, because those foundations are naturalized by the hidden presupposition of private property, which, as Marx showed, is the foundation of liberal social thought. This prevents it from addressing the fundamental question, which was the starting point of Marx's critique of liberal social theory. How do relations between people take the alienated form of relations between things? The limits of Marxism and the legacy of Marx. I have argued through this book that Marx's early theory of alienated labor, later developed in his theory of the form of value and the associated theory of commodity fetishism, offers a devastating critique of the conceptual foundations of liberal social theory, and defines an alternative basis on which to conceptualize the forms of capitalist social relations in which human sociability appears in the form of objective constraint. However, orthodox Marxism, far from building on Marx's critique of political economy, has neutralized its critical power by assimilating Marxism to the political economy and the materialist conception of history from which Marx had sought to disengage himself. This assimilation has equally defined the basis for the dominant critiques of Marxism, which have drawn on the Weberian critique of the naturalistic economism of marginalist economics. Thus Habermas has presented his sociology as one which derives its inspiration from the humanism of the young Marx, although its foundations are unequivocally Weberian, and categorically rejects the, quote, anthropology of labor, end quote, which supposedly underpins Marx's early theory of alienated labor and his subsequent adoption of the labor theory of value. However, the power and originality of Marx's work is as much lost by its assimilation to liberal sociology as it is by its assimilation to liberal economics. The dominant interpretations of Marx derive from the ways in which Marx's work has been appropriated ideologically within the context of the political polarization of the socialist movement provoked by the Bolshevik Revolution. It is a marked feature of this polarization that both sides share a common ground in distinguishing between Marx's early writings, in which he supposedly developed his philosophical worldview, quote, dialectical materialism, and his mature works, in which he developed his, quote, economics. Differences of interpretation concern not Marx's, quote, economics, but the status of this, quote, economics within his theory as a whole, which is defined by the philosophy within which it is supposedly inserted. Thus, the struggle within 20th century Marxism to claim the legacy of Marx has been primarily a philosophical struggle. The orthodox interpretations of Marx's mature works have been overwhelmingly, quote, economistic, in assimilating Marx to the conceptual framework of classical political economy, seeing the foundation of his, quote, economics in the classical labor theory of value, reinterpreted as a theory of exploitation, according to which the appropriation of surplus labor in the form of profit was based on the ownership of the means of production by the capitalist class, so that the class character of capitalist society is constituted by the property relations which determine the form of distribution, while socialism was reduced to a change in property relations from private to state property. Marx's critique of political economy was seen as a historicist critique, which noted the historical specificity of the capitalist mode of distribution, which political economy supposedly ignored, to point beyond capitalism to a new form of society. Thus, political economy was adequate to the early stages of capitalist development, in which the private appropriation of the product fostered the development of the forces of production. But in a mature capitalist society, such a mode of distribution acts as a fetter on the development of increasingly socialized production, calling for new forms of property. The subjective expression of this objective contradiction lies in the conflict between the rationality of the capitalist, representing an outdated mode of distribution, and that of the working class, representing socialized forms of production. According to this interpretation, the fundamental contradiction of capitalist society derives from the contradiction between the laws of production, which determine the progressive development of the forces of production, and the laws of distribution, defined by the private appropriation of the product. This contradiction is in turn only a particular manifestation of the fundamental laws of historical materialism, according to which the driving force of history is the development of the forces of production. Particular forms of property are appropriate to the development of the forces of production at particular stages in history. However, the development of the forms of property lags behind the development of the forces of production, as the class whose interests are served by that form of property seeks to hold on to its economic and political power until such time as the contradiction between the two provokes a revolution in the form of property. Thus Marx's, quote, historical materialism is identified with that of the Enlightenment, in seeing the historical development of society as the adaptation of social institutions to the unfolding of quasi-natural historical laws, with the links between the two being constituted by the class interests defined by ownership of the means of production, the difference being that Marx carried the historical process one stage further. It is hardly surprising that this critique of political economy, quote, on the basis of political economy, end quote, should be vulnerable to the critique of classical political economy developed by marginalist economics, which focused precisely on the labor theory of value, and by sociology, which focused on the narrow economism shared by orthodox Marxism and liberal economic theories. It is hardly surprising that orthodox Marxism has equally been unable to formulate a coherent theoretical critique of marginalism and modern sociology, since it rests ultimately on the same abstract foundations. Orthodox Marxist critiques of liberal social and economic theories have tended to be ideological critiques. Insisting that all theories express a particular class perspective, the difference between Marxism and liberal social theories being reduced to the class perspectives they express, without addressing the question of the theoretical coherence of the claims either of Marxism or of liberal social theory at all. The gap between the orthodox interpretations and Marx's own work stands out in the extent to which the orthodox interpretations abolished the constitutive role of labor, which is the basis of Marx's theories of alienated labor and commodity fetishism. The theory of commodity fetishism played a central role in the orthodox interpretation of Marx, but it was not seen as the culmination of Marx's early analysis of the alienated forms of social labor and his mature analysis of the value form, but was reduced to an ideological illusion which reflected the social relations arising in the sphere of exchange, expressing the competitive relations between fragmented groups of workers which are exploited politically and ideologically by the bourgeoisie. Within the Second International, it was believed that this illusion was contradicted by the workers' experience and the unmediated relation of exploitation in production, and so would be overcome by the growing unity of the organized working class, expressing the socialization of the forces of production. This confidence underpinned the socialist faith in the compatibility, indeed the identity, of socialism and democracy. As the expected revolution failed to arrive, and the spontaneous development of the working class movement appeared to lead in the direction of reform, rather than of revolution, the idea that the illusions of commodity fetishism would be dissipated by the spontaneous development of class struggle was one increasingly confined to the radical left. represented above all by Rosa Luxemburg and the Council Communists. Ayo! The majority of Marxists came to see the illusions of commodity fetishism, which underlay the rise of reformism, as a veil drawn over the immediate experience of the working class, which could only be penetrated by a scientific understanding of capitalism. This led to a radical separation between the, quote, reality and, quote, appearance of capitalist social relations, between, quote, economics and, quote, politics, and to a growing emphasis on the relative autonomy of politics and on the role of the subjective element in the class struggle embodied in the Revolutionary Party. The pervasiveness of the illusion of commodity fetishism implied that truth could not be gained from experience, but only through scientific knowledge of, quote, economic laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production, and the historical laws of development of society. Similarly, politics could not be based on experience, but only on the scientific knowledge of the possible. The foundations of Marxism no longer lay in the everyday reality of the class struggle, but in the philosophy of science which determined the scientific status of the Marxist laws. This posed serious problems at a time when the continued validity of those laws was being thrown into question. Thus, the fate of Marxism appeared increasingly to depend not on the historical development of the class struggle, but on the outcome of philosophical battles within the working class movement. The philosophical debates within Marxism developed in parallel with, and drew heavily on, contemporary debates within bourgeois philosophy, which were addressing essentially the same issues, albeit from a different perspective, of the methods of social science, of the character of historical laws, and of the relation between fact and value, between economics and politics. The most fundamental division which emerged within Marxism was the division between those, the most fundamental division which emerged within Marxism was that between those who drew on neo-Kantianism and those who developed a specifically Marxist version of neo-Hegelianism. The neo-Kantians adopted Engels' characterization of the, quote, materialist dialectic, end quote, as no more than the method of modern science, and were increasingly willing to revise Marxist orthodoxies in the light of the subsequent development of capitalism and of a return to Marx's text. Such revisions did not necessarily lead to a weakening of Marxism. The period produced some of the most original and creative thinking in the bleak history of orthodox Marxism. However, the defeat of the revolutionary upsurge in Western Europe after the First World War and the polarization of the socialist movement in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution left little space for a revolutionary Marxism independent of the Bolshevik and reformist orthodoxies. The triumph of right-wing revisionism was the triumph of neo-Kantian critique of Marxism pioneered by Bernstein and Fabianism. This interpretation of Marx accepted the marginalist critique of the labor theory of value, rejected the theory of commodity fetishism as metaphysical, distinguished the immediate tasks of social democracy, which were to express the economic interest of the working class within capitalism, from the achievement of socialism, which was seen as an ethical goal. This critique of orthodox Marxism and of the character of the socialist project closely paralleled that of Weber. Thus there has been a cross-fertilization and interweaving of social democratic reformism and Weberian sociology throughout the 20th century, producing a, quote, synthesis of Marx and Weber, which has nevertheless rested on unambiguously Weberian foundations. Lenin sought to found the scientific status of Marxism in the philosophy of dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism was invented by Plekhanov, deriving from Feuerbach more than Hegel, and in his hands was originally monistic materialism, seeing history as the expression of the dialectic of matter rather than of the idea. The role of dialectical materialism was to underpin the scientific status of the Marxist philosophy of history and of, quote, Marxist political economy, end quote, insulating the eternal truths of Marxism from empirical evaluation. Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy was canonized in Stalin's Dialectical and Historical Materialism, which is merely an expansion of Lenin's short essay, Karl Marx, which introduces the Moscow edition of Lenin's selected works. In Stalin's hands, dialectical materialism fossilized the economistic Marxism of the Second International, reducing it to a set of formulae to be ritually incanted and indiscriminately applied, with the party as the arbiter of truth. Marx's own work provides a powerful critique of orthodox Marxism as it does of liberalism. However, the revitalization of, quote, Western Marxism was not based on a return to the text of Marx, but drew primarily on the neo-Hegelian critiques of the sociology of Simmel and Weber, pioneered by Georg Lukács. When they spell it with the G-Y-O-R-G-Y, I get confused with Lukács. Lukács and the foundations of, quote, Western Marxism. Social democratic revisionism not only abandoned the revolutionary aspirations of Marxism, social democratic revisionism also diluted Weber's critique of capitalism in the priority which it gave to the immediate economic interest of the working class over the ethical goals of socialism. Although Weber was a harsh critic of Marxism, his critique of capitalism was in many ways truer to the spirit of Marx than was that of the economistic Marxism of his day. For Weber addressed not only the undoubted exploitative features of capitalism, but also the dehumanization and cultural degeneration inherent in capitalist, quote, rationalization. We have seen that Weber's pessimism derived from his radical Kantian individualism, but Hegel had already shown the way beyond Kant's individualism. It was on this basis that Georg Lukács developed his critique of economistic positivism. It was on this basis that Georg Lukács developed his critique of economistic positivism in his seminal work, History and Class Consciousness, first published in 1923, which laid the foundations of so-called Western Marxism. The focus of Lukács's interpretation of Marx was the theory of commodity fetishism. In History and Class Consciousness, Lukács presented a radical Hegelian interpretation of Marx, which drew heavily on the neo-Kantianism of Simmel and Weber. Although Lukács's book has been acclaimed as a remarkable anticipation of Marx's theory of alienation, the term is hardly used by Lukács, who places the concept of, quote, reification at the heart of the analysis, a concept which Lukács was the first person to employ in any systematic way. Lukács's work provided a grid through which many commentators read Marx's manuscripts when they were eventually published, as we have already seen, but Lukács's theory of reification has very little in common with Marx's theory of alienated labor. Lukács took his central idea of a social form as the reified product of human action from Simmel, drawing particularly on his philosophy of money, in which Simmel argued that money was a social form which had originally developed as the rational means to a human end, namely to facilitate exchange, but which then became reified and transformed into an end in itself, so that human values and human relationships were correspondingly transformed into the means to that end. Zimmel's argument has echoes of Marx's theory of commodity fetishism, which is not surprising because it was designed as a critique of Marx's theory, based on the marginalist critique of the labor theory of value. Thus, Zimmel took up Marx's theory of socioform, but detached it from the analysis of alienated labor to set it on liberal foundations. This led to a view of commodity fetishism as an essentially ideological phenomenon, a particular manifestation of a universal process of reification through which social forms acquire an autonomous existence, detached from the subjectivity which gave rise to them. For Zimmel, the irrational inversion of subject and object, means and ends, could not be explained as an ideological reflection of capitalist social relations, since the generalization of capitalist social relations already presupposed the subordination of human values and human relationships to the single end of monetary gain. Thus, the fetishism of commodities was the condition for the development of capitalism, not a reflection of an underlying economic process. To explain this development, Zimmel replaced Marx's theory of commodity fetishism with a philosophical account of the development of money from a means to an end in terms of a more general phenomenological process of inversion of means and ends. For Lukács, this meant that Zimmel could, quote, not go further than a description, end quote, of, quote, the most external and vacuous forms, end quote, of reification, making those forms, quote, independent and permanent by regarding them as the timeless model of human relations in general, end quote, divorcing these, quote, empty manifestations from their real capitalist foundation, end quote, so that he could not relate them to, quote, the basic phenomenon of reification itself, end quote. Lukács, History and Class Consciousness. This did not lead Lukács directly back to Marx's theory of commodity fetishism to locate Zimmel's analysis historically. Indeed, he proclaimed a Marxist intellectual tabula rasa in his bizarre declaration that, quote, orthodoxy refers exclusively to method, end quote, so that an orthodox Marxist could accept the disproof, quote, all of Marx's theses in toto without having to renounce his orthodoxy for a single moment, end quote. Lukács turned for his reevaluation of Marxism to Weber, who had brought Zimmel's analysis some of the way down to earth. Against Zimmel, Weber saw reification not as a universal phenomenological process, but as the expression of a particular system of values characterized by, quote, instrumental rationality, end quote, which gives rise to particular forms of social relations as a quote, unintended consequence, end quote. However, Weber could show no way out of the, quote, iron cage, end quote, created by instrumental rationality, because Weber regarded such a form of rationality as the necessary condition for economic and political progress, whatever the human cost. Thus, for Weber, as for Zimmel, a truly human viewpoint could only be expressed by an alternative set of values, which for Lukács represented no more than a subjective and romantic evaluation of an increasingly alien world. Lukács believed that he could break out of this melancholic moralizing by drawing on Hegel to break Weber's identification of instrumental rationality with the reason of history. For Lukács, as for Weber, what appears rational to the individual in a capitalist society becomes irrational as soon as it is regarded from the point of view of the whole. However, for Weber, the fragmentation of modern society means that the point of view of the totality is increasingly inaccessible to the participants in that society. So that Weber's critique of the substantive irrationality of capitalism tended to be that of a marginalized commentator. For Hegel, the point of view of the totality is that of reason, which reaches its fruition in Hegel's own philosophy. However, for Lukács, such a perspective is not available to the individual, however great a philosopher that individual might be. Quote, "The totality of an object can only be posited if the positing subject is itself a totality. In modern society, only the classes can represent the total point of view." End quote. History and Class Consciousness, Lukács. The class perspective of the bourgeoisie remains a limited perspective because the class perspective of the bourgeoisie regards its own. The class perspective of the bourgeoisie remains a limited perspective because the bourgeoisie regards its own rule as absolute and so remains bound to its class viewpoint. Quote, "It was necessary for the proletariat to be born, for social reality to become fully conscious. The reason for this is that the discovery of the class outlook of the proletariat provided a vantage point from which to survey the whole of society." End quote. If Hegel provided the methodological key in adopting the point of view of the totality, Marx brought this totality down to earth by locating it in the emerging self-consciousness of the universal class. The point of view of the totality is not a mechanical reflection of the experience of the working class. Quote, "The class consciousness of the proletariat, the truth of the process as subject, is itself far from stable and constant. The class consciousness of the proletariat does not advance according to mechanical laws. The class consciousness of the proletariat is the consciousness of the dialectical process itself. It is likewise a dialectical concept." End quote. History and Class Consciousness, Lukács. Thus, the point of view of the totality only emerges through the unremitting theoretical criticism of more restricted viewpoints, each of which contains a partial truth. The partiality of this truth is not measured by its distance from some eternal truth, but by the internal contradictions to which the universalistic aspirations of each particular ideology give rise, contradictions which appear externally in the contradiction between contending and apparently mutually exclusive ideologies. In particular, the point of view of the totality implies the reunification of subject and object, and so the dialectical synthesis of the one-sided Hegelian focus on, quote, ideology, and the one-sided Marxist focus on, quote, the economy. Although this synthesis is achieved through the Hegelian process of theoretical critique, and so remains on the side of ideology, Lukács claims that it transcends Hegelian idealism in adopting the standpoint of the universal class. So it represents not merely a speculative unification of subject and object, but the self-realization of subject and object's unity. Moreover, this is not merely a speculative commitment. It is a practical commitment. For, as Lenin has shown, the, quote, form taken by the class consciousness of the working class is the party, end quote, which, as Rosa Luxemburg perceived, is the, quote, bearer of the class consciousness of the proletariat and the consciousness of the proletariat's historical vocation, end quote. History and Class Consciousness. The achievement of proletarian self-consciousness confronts formidable barriers, the most serious of which is, quote, the separation of the economic struggle from the political struggle, end quote, which derives from the, quote, contradiction between its immediate interest and its long-term objectives, end quote. Its immediate objectives are tied to its concrete situation, which is, quote, by its very nature, an integral part of the existing capitalist society, end quote. While its achievement of its long-term objectives depends on its overcoming the particularity of concrete demands by integrating immediate interest into a total view, a, quote, total view. This means that it is important not to follow opportunism in mistaking, quote, the actual psychological state of consciousness of proletarians for the class consciousness of the proletariat, end quote. History and Class Consciousness. Quote, the objective theory of class consciousness is the theory of its objective possibility, end quote. History and Class Consciousness, behind which lies the proletariat's necessary aspiration towards the truth. The true essence of class consciousness, quote, can only become visible in its authentic form when the historical process imperiously requires it to come into force, i.e., when an acute crisis in the economy drives it to action, end quote. The integration of immediate interests into a, quote, total view can only be achieved, quote, in the consciousness of the proletariat itself, end quote. But the development of this consciousness is impeded by the fact that, quote, in a world where the reified relations of capitalism have the appearance of a natural environment, it looks as if there is not a unity, but a diversity of mutually independent objects and forces, end quote. Thus, quote, reification is the primary ideological barrier to the development of proletarian self-consciousness. Lukács located the source of reification in the, quote, fetishism of commodities, in which, quote, a relation between people takes on the character of a thing and thus acquires a, quote, phantom objectivity and autonomy that seems so strictly rational and all-embracing as to conceal every trace of its fundamental nature, the relation between people, end quote. However, Lukács did not derive the ideological form of the fetishism of commodities from the alienation of labor, but if anything, the other way around. Quote, the universality of the commodity form is responsible, both objectively and subjectively, for the abstraction of the human labor incorporated in commodities, end quote. Although he adds that, quote, this universality becomes historically possible because this process of abstraction has been completed, end quote. The alienation of labor and the fetishism of commodities are both explained in Weberian terms. As the result of, quote, the principle of rationalization based on what is and can be calculated, end quote. This rationalization is synonymous with, quote, the progressive elimination of the qualitative, human and individual attributes of the worker, end quote, as the, quote, process of labor is progressively broken down into abstract, rational, specialized operations, end quote, while with Taylorist methods, this, quote, rational mechanization extends right into the worker's soul, end quote. This rationalization, quote, must declare war on the organic manufacture of whole products based on the traditional amalgam of empirical experiences of work, end quote. The resulting, quote, fragmentation of the object of production necessarily entails the fragmentation of production's subject, end quote. Quote, just as the capitalist system continuously produces and reproduces itself economically on higher levels, the structure of reification progressively sinks more deeply, more fatefully, and more definitively into the consciousness of man. End quote. Moreover, this reification affects not only economic relations, but also legal and political institutions. Lukács substantiates this claim not by quoting Marx's account of the alienated form of the state, which has nothing to do with the principle of rationalization, but with a long quote from Weber. As for Weber, the process of rationalization is an all-embracing process, so that the process of reification weaves an all-embracing cage as it, quote, stamps its imprint upon the whole consciousness of man, end quote. Nevertheless, while this reason secures, quote, the rationalization of isolated aspects of life, end quote, the total process is relatively irrational. The explanation of this irrationality is again Weberian. It is the result of the unintended consequences of rational individual action, which arise because the individual cannot possibly be aware of the societal consequences of the individual's atomistic actions. Thus arises the contradiction between form and content, between Weber's, quote, formal rationality of capitalism and capitalism's, quote, substantive irrationality, a contradiction which, like the, quote, alienation of labor, is a consequence of the division of labor. Unlike Weber, Lukács finds a chink of light which contains the potential for a new dawn. The manual worker, it turns out, is not really alienated. Quote, for his work, as he experiences it, directly possesses the naked and abstract form of the commodity, end quote. The exploitative relation is transparent, since the manual worker has no human interest in her work. Unlike the intellectual or the bureaucrat, the manual worker has not, quote, sold his humanity and his soul, end quote, so retains her human aspirations, which conflict with the dehumanization of, quote, rationalized labor. These aspirations do not immediately lead to the formation of class consciousness, because they do not immediately penetrate the systematic illusions of commodity fetishism, so that, quote, as long as he does not consciously rebel against it, end quote, reification, quote, cripples and atrophies his soul, end quote. But they do represent, quote, an aspiration towards society in its totality, regardless of whether this aspiration remains conscious or whether it remains unconscious for the moment, end quote. And it is this aspiration that gives a necessary direction to the development of proletarian class consciousness, a direction which leads it to penetrate the illusions of reification. This is necessarily a brief summary of Lukács' theory. However, an immediate observation is that the one thing missing from Lukács' account is any coherent theory of the alienation of labor. As Lukács noted almost 50 years later, quote, labor as the mediator of the metabolic interaction between society and nature is missing, end quote. So that, quote, the most important real pillars of the Marxist view of the world disappear. This means the disappearance of the ontological objectivity of nature, but it also means the disappearance of the interaction between labor and the evolution of the men who labor. End quote. The, quote, fetishism of commodities is not the result of the alienation of labor, but of the reification engendered by the progressive rationalization of society, which accompanies the development of the division of labor, which fragments the experience of labor, both subjectively and objectively. The dehumanization of labor is the subjective result of the subordination of labor to the anonymous forces of rationalization and the division of labor. This leads to an inverted interpretation of Marx's theory of alienation, according to which the alienation of labor is not the source of mystified and estranged social relationships, but describes the unself-conscious reflection of the experience of reification. Thus, the alienation of labor is a reflection of other social processes, just one manifestation of the wider societal phenomenon of reification. Lukács's theory rests on a view of reification as a reflection of the pervasive rationalization of society, a process through which all human powers become incorporated in things, in which social relationships become properties of things, and in which, quote, all relationships between men in the world of capitalism appear as relations between things, end quote. Marcuse. This alienated world may be a distortion of a properly human reality, but it is the world in which modern men and women are condemned to live, a world in which human beings are stripped of their human powers, in which they are subordinated as atomistic individuals to a world of objects subject to the constraining power of immutable laws. This theory of reification contrasts sharply with Marx's theory of alienated labor, within which alienation is hardly a passive experience. Alienation is an active process in which labor is the subject, a process of labor's self-alienation, end quote. Since Lukács separates alienation from alienation's origins in the activity of labor and sees it only as the passive reflection of a totalizing process of reification, which defines the ideological framework of human experience, Lukács is no better able than Simmel to explain the socio-historical foundations of alienation, nor to locate the possibility of overcoming it. For Lukács, the basis on which reification can be overcome is the worker's, quote, humanity and his soul, end quote, which alone remains unmarked by reification. However, it is not at all clear how the human aspirations of workers, which are necessarily fragmented and repressed by the rationalization of labor, can make themselves socially effective. In history and class consciousness, Lukács oscillates between a, quote, ultra-leftist, end quote, view of true consciousness as emerging spontaneously from the struggle of the proletariat, quote, when an acute crisis in the economy drives the proletariat to action, end quote, and a, quote, Leninist, end quote, view of truth as the product of a totalizing science, the two being reconciled by his assertion that the proletariat adopts the viewpoint of the totality. Lukács was soon persuaded to renounce his, quote, ultra-leftism and to adhere unequivocally to the Leninist position. However, his work had already acquired a life of its own. The dialectic of enlightenment. Lukács's theory of reification was taken up as the basis of a reinterpretation of Marxism by the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, and particularly by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, which eventually rejected the Marxist elements in Lukács's account. to set the theory of reification back on its Weberian foundations. This process was completed by Habermas's assimilation of critical theory back into the mainstream of modern sociology. However, Habermas's critique of Marxism expresses not so much the inadequacy of Marx's own work as the inadequacy of Lukács's original interpretation. For Lukács's reification was the product of the Weberian process of rationalization. However, in Lukács's own account, it is not clear whether reification is the product of the subordination of reason to the power of capital, or whether it is the product of, quote, instrumental reason itself. The former interpretation would take us back towards Marx, locating the source of reification in alienated labor and the fetishism of commodities. The latter interpretation, which is that of the Frankfurt School, would seem to take us back to the Weberian dilemma. For if rationality is an essential achievement of humanity, and reification a necessary result of the advance of reason, alienation would appear to be the inevitable price of progress. The critique of alienation could then be no more than a contemplative, moralistic critique, whether in the form of Weber's moralizing critique of humanity's tragic fate, or the equally impotent, irrationalist critique of bourgeois reason, developed by Nietzsche and Heidegger, or Husserl's contemplative transcendental project of overcoming alienation through the rediscovery of the meaning imposed on the world by human intentionality, all of which have served, as noted in Chapter 3, as grids through which to read Marx's early works. The Frankfurt School sought a way around this dilemma by distinguishing between the, quote, instrumental reason, which leads to reification, and some more fundamental form of reason, drawing particularly on Weber's distinction between, quote, instrumental rationality and, quote, value rationality. We have seen that Lukács derived his theory of reification from Zimmel's phenomenological analysis of the inversion of means and ends, and from Weber's account of rationalization, which Lukács identified with the limited class perspective of the bourgeoisie. Adorno and Horkheimer replaced Lukács's, quote, reductionist theory of the class origins of rational domination by looking for its origins within the rationalist project itself, going back to Nietzsche's instrumental view of truth as the expression of the will to power. The central concern of the Frankfurt School, raised by the tyrannies of Hitler and Stalin, was that of the relationship between reason and domination, which they saw as lying at the heart of Weber's sociology. Adorno and Horkheimer traced the link between reason and domination back to its roots in the Enlightenment. They saw the limitations of the reason of the Enlightenment in its totalitarian ambition, based on the belief that human liberation is to be achieved by the intellectual and practical domination of nature. However, the boundary between the natural and the human worlds was not fixed, but was a construct of reason. The ambition to subordinate the external world to reason soon confronts human aspirations as a barrier to its project, which it overcomes by assimilating humanity to nature, in reducing men and women to means to its transcendental ends. Thus, reification is a result of the totalitarian ambition of instrumental reason, and Lukács's critique of capitalism is replaced by the critique of the reason of the Enlightenment. Although the Enlightenment promised human liberation through the rule of reason, The reason of the Enlightenment turned out to be not the key to human liberation, but the means of domination of nature and of humanity. The exercise of reason supposedly depends on the ability to capture the world in a net of fixed analytical concepts, predictably related by rigid mechanical laws. Thus, the rationalist project implies the reduction of nature and humanity to the role of means and the status of things. However, these concepts and laws can never be adequate to a human world in a state of permanent change. This inadequacy appears not simply from a subjective point of view, but also objectively, within the realm of ideas, in the form of the necessary emergence of contradictions which arise in any system of totalitarian thought when it confronts a world in change. In particular, within the thought of the Enlightenment, the contradiction appears between the values espoused by the Enlightenment and the impoverished means the Enlightenment adopted to realize those values, between its, quote, instrumental rationality and its, quote, value rationality. Thus, the critique of reification comes not from outside, whether from the privileged experience of labor or from a privileged insight into some human essence, but from within. The limits of bourgeois thought, for the critical theorist as for Lukács, following Weber, are revealed through a theoretical critique which draws out the contradictions to which its limited viewpoint gives rise. Where the critical theorist broke with Lukács was in rejecting his belief that Marxism offered a system of thought that could overcome the limitations of the Enlightenment project by subordinating reason to the aspirations of a universal class. For Adorno and Horkheimer, Lukács' interpretation of Marxism abandoned the critical power of Marx's dialectic to assimilate it to the Enlightenment project. Lukács', quote, proletariat, being a purely metaphysical construct which serves not to undermine but to legitimate totalitarian ambitions of reason. They saw the roots of this degeneration in Marx's own work, criticizing what they saw as Marx's anthropology of labor, his fetishizing of the working class, his reification of nature, and his positivist concept of science. For Adorno and Horkheimer, no system of thought can ever be adequate to the world, so that the task of critical reason is always negative. The result was that their critique remained essentially skeptical, unable to define any positive political project because they had no existential basis on which to define such a project. Although Marcuse shared much of Adorno's and Horkheimer's critique of instrumental reason, his work drew more on Heidegger than on Nietzsche, as we have seen. This gave his critique an existential foundation, which that of Adorno and Horkheimer lacked, on which to base his political commitment. For Marcuse, reification derived not from the Enlightenment project as such, but from the subordination of reason to capitalist domination. Thus, Marcuse sought to locate the power of critical reason in the human needs and potentialities which capitalism could not fulfill. However, his anthropological approach led him to seek these human aspirations not within capitalism, but in spheres uncontaminated by capitalist rationality, and this led him to reject the working class as the social base of the critique of instrumental rationality. His search for the source of this critical power led Marcuse first to Freud and then later to those, quote, marginalized strata whose needs and potentialities had not been subordinated to capitalist rationality. Moreover, although Marcuse saw capitalism as lying behind the domination of, quote, instrumental reason, it was not the capitalist deformation of instrumental reason, but instrumental reason itself which was the source of the evils of modern society. Thus, Marcuse directed his critique as much against modern science and technology as against capitalist exploitation. The starting point of Habermas's thought was the attempt to recover the liberating project of the reason of the Enlightenment from the irrationalism of the project of the critical theorists, without falling back onto a, quote, foundationalism, which gave that power a transcendental foundation. Habermas's system of thought is based on the distinction between the activity of labor, in which human beings transform nature through the instrumentally rational application of technical rules and procedures, and the activity of, quote, communication, in which human interaction is based on the communication of mutual needs and interests, which presupposes a system of institutionalized rules which make communication possible. The rational foundation of society as a collective order then lies in the necessary presuppositions of human communication. Communication presupposes a commitment to truth, and the only rational basis of truth is a consensus freely reached between parties to communication. Thus, a rational society is a society in which the legitimacy of social institutions is underpinned by such a, quote, rational consensus. The sphere in which such a consensus is formed is the sphere of civil society. The sphere in which such a consensus is formed is the sphere of civil society. And the rationality of a consensus formed in civil society is determined by the degree to which communication in civil society is marked by the freedom and equality of the interacting parties. Thus, Habermas does not see the degeneration of reason as inherent in the Enlightenment project, but as deriving from the displacement of communicative reason by instrumental reason, as the rich and powerful subordinate reason to their own practical interests. Habermas's project brings critical theory full circle, returning first to a reformulation of the Weberian dilemma, and then in his later work to the normative functionalism of Talcott Parsons. Habermas certainly provides normative functionalism with a critical edge that normative functionalism lacked in Parsons' hands, but his theory still rests on the dualism of structure and action, of the, quote, positivist and the, quote, idealist theories of action, which derives, as I have argued, from the abstraction of the economy from society. Thus, in taking as his starting point the marginalist characterization of the economy as the sphere of labor, in which human beings transform nature through the rational application of technical rules and procedures, Habermas presupposes the instrumental rationality of capitalist relations of production and exchange, supposedly demonstrated by marginalist economics, leaving only the initial allocation of resources, which determines the distribution of the product, as a matter of substantive evaluative judgment. Thus, Habermas does not question the rationality of alienated labor, but looks beyond the sphere of labor both for the, quote, practical interests, which derive from the inequality of distribution, and which lie behind the subordination of society to instrumentally rational forms of domination, and for the, quote, communicative interests, which underlie the possibility of human liberation. By denying that the sphere of labor is a sphere of communication, in which the communicative interests of the working class are suppressed, by denying that the sphere of labor is a sphere of communication, in which the communicative interests of the working class are suppressed, Habermas denies the possibility of restoring the human qualities of labor to the activity of labor itself. However, Marx's theory of alienated labor shows that the contrast between communicative reason and instrumental reason is not a contrast between two forms of reason, corresponding to distinct interests, but is a contrast between the inherently social character of human existence and the alienated forms in which human sociability is expressed. For critical theory, instrumental reason, which supposedly implies the reduction of human beings and of nature to the status of means, to the attainment of given ends, is necessarily a reason of domination. But if this is the case, the question immediately arises of what is, quote, rational about this form of rationality. Is domination the price that must inevitably be paid, for good or ill, for the benefits of economic and technological progress and administrative efficiency, as Weber and the economists implied? Or is this domination a culturally specific and ultimately irrational feature of Western modernity, implicit in the contradictory character of the dialectic of the Enlightenment, which proclaimed liberating power of a stunted instrumental reason, as Horkheimer and Adorno argued? Or is it capitalism which has imposed the restricted, quote, capitalist rationality on humanity, in the guise of a neutral, quote, technical reason, as the means of securing and reproducing its, quote, specific dominative interest, end quote, as Marcuse argued? Or does the dialogic, quote, communicative reason of civil society provide the antidote to the monologic, quote, instrumental reason of economic and political domination, as Habermas argues? Or does the deformation of reason lie elsewhere, in the alienated form of labor, which underlies the inversion of means and ends, as Marx had argued? The irrationality of capitalism and the alienation of labor. Lukács and the critical theorists offered a variety of means of resolving Weber's dilemma, but their solutions all remained within the framework of Weber's diagnosis of the contradictions of modernity, because they retained Weber's conception of the development of modern capitalism as a progressive rationalization of society, a conception whose coherence, I have argued, derives implicitly from marginalist economics. The result was that, like Weber, they sought the possibilities of human liberation in another form of reason, whose source they variously identified in the proletariat and its party, in the sphere of art and higher culture, in the unconscious, in marginalized social strata of civil society, which had managed to avoid incorporation into the instrumental reason of modernity. The reason for this assimilation of critical theory to the Weberian perspective was the failure to look behind orthodox Marxism to the work of Marx. For orthodox Marxism, dominative reason was reduced to the interests of a dominant class. The critical theorist shared Weber's critique of this reductionist concept of, quote, instrumental reason, on the grounds that rationalization and the associated process of reification pervades the whole of modern culture. Workers are as ready as capitalists to treat others as things in pursuit of their own interests. Workers, as much as capitalists, seek to satisfy their human needs by the acquisition of things. Thus, rationality is not so much the instrument of domination as the ideology which conceals domination by, quote, naturalizing the human objects of domination, and so assimilating social relations to the world of nature. For the critical theorist, this assimilation is the result of the, quote, fetishism of commodities, in which social qualities appear in the form of things, but the fetishism of commodities is itself seen as a construct of instrumental reason, and so as an ideological phenomenon. Their critique of capitalism is therefore reduced to a cultural critique. Marx's theory of alienated labor provides a way beyond the antinomies of modern sociology, which seek to reconcile the subjective rationality of capitalism with its objective irrationality, on the basis of an abstract concept of the individual and an abstract concept of reason. The world of alienated labor is not a world under the rule of instrumental reason, but a profoundly irrational and contradictory world, in which any form of rationality is subverted by the systematic dissociation of the intentions of human actors from the outcome of social action. This dissociation is not the result of the arbitrary intervention of unforeseen circumstances, but is the systematic result of the alienated forms of social labor through which human sociability is imposed by the subordination of the individual to a thing. Thus, alienation is not the result of a subjective attitude to labor, the expression of, quote, reified consciousness, but is an objective characteristic of the social forms of capitalist production and reproduction, of which, quote, reification is the subjective expression. Similarly, the reified consciousness cannot be seen as an expression of the deformed reason of the Enlightenment, since it is the alienated forms of social labor which define the limits of the rationality of that reason. Competition imposes the, quote, rationality of capitalism on individuals as an objective force, submitting capitalists no less than the working class to its contradictory logic, but an abstraction from the fragmentation of social relations imposed by the rule of competition, which is only another expression of the alienated forms of social labor. The, quote, rationality of capitalism is profoundly irrational. Finally, if capitalism is profoundly irrational, domination cannot be seen as an immanent in the rationalist project of the Enlightenment, but on the contrary, that project leads to the radical critique of the stunted reason of capitalism. The contradictions of capitalism do not derive from the contradiction between one form of reason and another form of reason, whether between formal and substantive rationality or between capitalist and proletarian reason, but from the contradictions inherent in the irrationality of alienated forms of social production. The irrationality of capitalism is a, quote, unintended consequence of subjectively rational action, but the irrationality of capitalism is a consequence which is systematically embedded in and determined by forms of social relation whose social character is not given immediately, arising from social interaction between people engaged in cooperative activity, but is imposed on people by the mediated form of social relations, in which the social character of their labor confronts them in the form of a thing. It is Marx's demystification of the, quote, fetishism of commodities through his analysis of the value form that makes it possible to penetrate the apparently objective character of this social determination to reestablish its human origins. For Marx, the fetishism of commodities is not simply an ideological mystification, to be referred back to a constitutive subject, whether that subject be a class interest or the dominative interest of reason itself. The fetishism of commodities is only the reflection of a real social process constituted by the social relations of alienated labor. It really is the case that social labor only appears in the form of a thing, and that it really is the case that the products of labor confront the laborer as an objective power. However, alienation is not the expression of an ideological process of, quote, reification, in which subjectivity is eradicated. Alienation is a process which starts from labor as the subjective element, which is never effaced. It is not that human powers become incorporated in things, but that human qualities appear in the form of the properties of things. It is not that social relations appear as relations between things, but that social relations appear in the form of relations between things. These forms of appearance arise not because relations between things replace or conceal relations between persons, but because relations between persons are mediated by things. Thus, reification does not constitute a self-sufficient world which is imposed on human beings, but rather a world which is only constituted and reproduced through human activity, and so a world which can always be reclaimed by that activity. The theory of commodity fetishism does not provide a solution to the sociological problem of the relation between subject and object, individual and society, structure and action, because it denies the legitimacy of the sociological formulation of the problem. The formal opposition and formal reconciliation of individual and society is a problem which can neither be posed nor resolved in the abstract. Individuals only exist within social relationships, whose particular forms are constituted historically, while social relationships only exist between individuals and are reproduced and transformed by the practical activity of individuals. The radical opposition of individual and society is not constitutive of the human condition, but is the historical result of the development of the particular alienated forms of human sociability characteristic of capitalist society. Unlike Durkheim, who explained the constraining character of social facts by their quality as things, Marx insisted that the fact that commodities are things implies that commodities, quote, therefore lack the power to resist man, end quote. In a capitalist society, it really is the case that the subject confronts society as an objective and constraining world beyond human control. Thus, the antinomies of modern sociology are not simply intellectual fabrications, but are the intellectual expression of real oppositions. This is why, for all their faults, Weber and the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory could offer a penetrating diagnosis of the human condition without being able to explain it or to see any way of overcoming it. The antinomies of modern sociology can be understood theoretically as an expression of the alienated forms of capitalist social relations. However, they cannot be overcome by theory, but only by overcoming the alienated forms of social relations in practice. This is what Marx meant when he wrote in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Commodity fetishism cannot be overcome in consciousness through the subjective recovery of the human being of alienated social forms, without overcoming it in practice, by developing new social forms in which the social character of human activity is expressed directly. For Marx, this practice could only be that of the working class. The opposition of individual and society is not an immutable structural characteristic of modern society. but is only reproduced through the reproduction of the alienated forms of social labor. This reproduction is not automatic, but is the outcome of a pervasive and permanent class struggle, in which the working class resists its subordination to the alienated forms of capitalist domination. The working class is not simply the object of domination of the, quote, instrumental rationality of capitalism. However alienated may be the forms of social labor under capitalism, the fact nevertheless remains that the creative powers of cooperative labor remain the only source of social wealth and of the surplus value appropriated by the capitalist class. For Marx, the contradiction inherent in the social form of capitalist domination is that the production and appropriation of surplus value depends on capital developing the creative powers of social labor, and so developing the working class as a collective social power, while the reproduction of capitalist domination depends on capital restricting the development of this social power within the limits of the social relations of capitalist production by securing the fragmentation of the working class and the restriction of the working class's subjective aspirations. The subjective expression of this contradiction is to be found in the development of the class struggle, which cannot be reduced to the opposition of consciously articulated class interests, expressing conflicting and mutually exclusive forms of, quote, class reason, but more fundamentally express the contradictions of capitalist, quote, rationality, which simultaneously develops and represses the aspirations of the working class. The objective expression of this contradiction lies in the necessarily crisis-ridden character of capitalist accumulation, which again does not derive from the imperfect subordination of society to capitalist rationality, which can potentially be overcome by the perfected rationality of, quote, organized capitalism, but is inherent in the contradictory form of that, quote, rationality. In the contradiction between the tendency for capital to develop the productive forces without limit and the need to confine the productive forces' development within the limits of the social relations of capitalist production. Thus, the source of the critical opposition to the dehumanization imposed by capitalist society does not lie outside the sphere of capitalist, quote, rationality, but within the sphere of capitalist rationality as the expression of its inherent contradictions. As Marx argued, the limit of capital is capital itself. Marx was naively optimistic in his belief that socialism would inevitably arise out of the spontaneous development of the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production. But the tragedy of Marxism, in both Marxism's Leninist and its Western variants, was that it abandoned Marx's faith in the ability of the working class to achieve its own emancipation. This led Marxism to detach the liberating potential of Marx's critique of capitalism from its concrete foundations in the socialization of the working class, to locate it not in the collective organization of the working class, but in the alienated forms in which the socialization of labor developed under capitalism, as the concentration and centralization of capital. Socialism was then identified not with the transformation of social relations of production, but only with the nationalization of the means of production, so that human social powers confronted the individual in the equally alienated detached form of the state. The critical theorists, on the other hand, detached Marx's critique of capitalism from any social or historical foundation, to reduce it to a philosophical critique whose tragedy was that it found itself increasingly in the interstices of culture and on the margins of society. The collapse of state socialism in both its communist and social democratic forms heralds the death of Marxism in the forms in which it has dominated the 20th century. It would be naively optimistic to expect that the collapse of old orthodoxies will necessarily create the conditions for a rebirth of Marxism. Nevertheless, the collapse of state socialism does nothing to overcome the contradictions of capitalism, nor to resolve the antinomies of liberalism. Indeed, the polarization of wealth and power, the tendencies to the overaccumulation and uneven development of capital, the dehumanization of culture and society, the removal of human destiny from any form of human control, have developed to an unprecedented degree and on a global scale. As the twin threats of economic and ecological crisis become ever more menacing, the need to develop new social forms becomes ever more urgent. In such circumstances, it may be that Marxism can recover its heritage to resume the project which Marx initiated of linking an emancipatory social theory to an emancipatory social practice.